Ukraine says that its recent incursion into Russian territory has made a mockery of Putin's red lines and that the West should go all in to help it win the war. I discussed the options with the Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen on Conflict Zone. Finland knows a lot about red lines from Russia. It crossed one last year when it decided to abandon decades of neutrality in favor of joining NATO. And given its expansive border, defending against aggression from Moscow has always been a core focus. So how does she see the prospect of turning the tide in Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And what other threats does she see on the horizon? For example, in her own backyard, the Arctic. Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you so much.
I want to begin with Ukraine because you are a strong supporter of the country's defense. As Ukraine pushes to hold on to summertime gains in Russia's Kursk region, doesn't it show that Putin's red lines might not be as red as he wants the West to believe?
I think it shows exactly that. And I think in the West in general, we perhaps not just over the course of the past 2.5 years with the full-scale full-scale war that Russia is waging in Ukraine, but also before that, we have perhaps been too hesitant to believe and stick to our own values and know what the truth is. And that is obviously relying on the international rules-based order and the UN Charter, for instance. And also in this regard, we do see that in some instances, the rhetoric we hear from the Russians is much more aggressive than what they are really intending to pull through.
So given that, how far would Finland be willing to go to support Ukraine? Because, I mean, you've previously said that the Finnish position is clear, and I'm quoting you here. You've said that we are not right now sending any troops and not willing to discuss that. Is the day fast approaching when you're going to have to discuss it?
Our stance has not changed in that regard. But for instance, what comes to the military equipment, the defense material, the ammunition we have sent to Ukraine, we haven't set any constraints on the usage other than, of course, international law and the UN Charter. And I think this is very important to keep in mind because we who are helping Ukraine and also Ukraine who has the lawful right to defend itself for as long as and while we keep in the realm of international law, then there shouldn't be any red line and nothing to be afraid about.
You haven't put any geographical restrictions on the weaponry, but some of your NATO partners and allies have. Ukraine, meantime, is saying that it needs the green light from countries to use their donated weapons inside Russia. Should your allies and partners lift to those bans?
I can only speak on behalf of Finland, and Finland from the outset has not set any constraints on the material. I do know that some of our friends and allies do have some concerns, but again, for as long as we remain in the area stipulated by international law and UN Charter, like we are.
Right, but you've previously said that it's an issue that you're taking up with your fellow NATO alliance ministers, foreign ministers, excuse me. What are other leaders and foreign ministers telling you when you take this up with them?
Well, I'm not commenting on their behalf, but our message is clear, and I have also taken this up bilaterally with my colleagues, and I just hope that we will be able to help Ukraine in the best possible way.
Put this into the big picture for us, because you've said that you shouldn't rule anything out in the long term, as we've heard, including sending troops. Isn't the risk that at some point it will be too late?
Yes, well, we are, of course, scrutinizing the situation on a daily basis together with our allies and partners. But again, this is not a situation when it would be about sending troops to Ukraine. This is not something Finland is considering at the moment. But of course, in the long term, it's important that we don't rule everything out. On the contrary, it's very important that we stick to a narrative which is clear and a strategy that we help Ukraine, who has the lawful right to defend itself. And based on the UN Charter, we also have the right to help Ukraine to defend itself, its territory and its sovereignty. So whatever is needed now and in the future, of course, we will have to also be flexible and agile enough to see what it is exactly that is needed.
I'd like to ask you further about, some of your allies' biggest concerns, which is the threat of contagion. We've seen recently NATO members Romania and Latvia, they have just reported Russian drones crashing after breaching their airspace. Is the risk of drawing NATO nations into the conflict increasing right now?
Well, so far, not just in the past 2.5 years, certainly in this time, but also years before, it has only been Russia who has been responsible for this escalation. Ukraine has been trying to coexist with its much larger neighbor and carefully evolving itself into a proper democracy, get rid of corruption and everything, which of course takes a long time after such a long time in the Soviet Union and everything. I think we should not consider so easily to take this sort of the blame on us. Russia, of course, has been using this narrative for ages that it's the West who, edged too close, or NATO was coming too close to its border. But at the same time, we haven't been threatening Russia. NATO certainly does not take new countries by force, but it's countries who democratically just want to join. And at the same time, now we have seen that also during this war, and now especially recently in the past weeks and even days, some of Russia's material has landed basically in NATO countries. So this is extremely important that we take this seriously, we investigate these matters, and then we react decisively.
Let's talk a little bit more about that reaction, because there are calls for NATO to act jointly to counter such air incursions. I'd like to take it to something that Poland has previously said, that it and other countries bordering Ukraine have a duty to shoot down incoming Russian missiles before they enter their airspace. Now, NATO has rejected this proposal. It has said it risks the alliance becoming part of the conflict. What should NATO do?
This is something we are carefully now investigating, and NATO will, of course, comment when the time comes. But so far, this is indeed the case. But at the same time, each nation is also responsible for protecting its own airspace and the security of their own citizens. So in this regard, we really need to take this situation very, very seriously.
But it goes back to, the joint approach and how much on side and how united NATO allies are in any potential response. NATO allies have said previously, we have to do whatever we can to help Ukraine and whatever we can to avoid escalation. And, the question is that still a realistic approach given the current set of conditions on the ground?
That certainly is still and remains the approach that also Finland is supporting. But of course, what is debatable and is debatable every day also as the conflict evolves is that what should be counted as a step towards escalation. Because as said, it is not Ukraine and not us, the other countries who have been helping Ukraine in these 2.5 years, who have been responsible for the escalation. It's been Russia.
I'd like to ask you briefly about the sense of resolve about supporting Ukraine among your NATO allies. You are a member of the EU. As we've mentioned, you're a very strong supporter of Ukraine. We have seen some cracks emerge in the United States. Presidential candidate Trump has suggested that he could halt American aid. There's no guarantee, meantime, that Harris can continue Biden's policies on Ukraine if she were to win the election. How could Europe maintain the level of support needed if necessary? Because here in Europe, you also have a situation where Germany appears to be wavering amid a budget crisis. How concerning is that for you?
Well, it's very concerning. And also in Finland, of course, we have been over the years paying a high price for our own security and our own defense. And now, of course, as members in NATO, we are investing even heavier into it in order to not only keep safe ourselves, but also to be able to protect the entire alliance if need be. But the burden is, of course, there. But at the same time, we need to understand, and our citizens need to understand that there is no such thing as sort of too many euros or too many dollars for the security and for being able to protect the values which we, at the end of the day, want to be protecting. So it's democracy, the freedom, rule of law, and human rights effectively. And perhaps here in Finland, because well, we have been invaded by Russia in the past, and luckily, after the Second World War, we were able to remain independent. But we do see what the difference is behind the border. Of course, none of these values that we hold dear are sacred. So, therefore, we know that we, want to keep things as they are, and therefore also we feel very strong sympathy with the Ukrainians who unfortunately haven't been independent for too long yet, who really have decided to walk the way that they become a proper democracy, that they that people can live in freedom and according to the European way of life and so on and so forth. So I think it's our human duty to keep on helping Ukraine.
So let's take it to, your own security and the threat that Russia poses, because, you've highlighted there the fact that Finland is taking this whole of society approach and that you have a high level of readiness. You know how you have done it for many decades to deter the threat from Russia. You've got this 1,300 kilometer border, in fact, with the country. Your intelligence agency is now saying that Russia's actions remain the greatest threat to Finland's national security. Russia is treating Finland as an unfriendly state and as a target for espionage and malign influence and activities. How do you see the challenges of living in this new system now, where poor relations with Russia appear to be the norm?
Unfortunately, it is Russia who is responsible for the poor state of our relations. Indeed, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's no way that we can go back, if ever, but definitely not easily to any relations whatsoever. Of course, Finland, just like any other European country in the past, say, 2 decades, we hope that Russia would finally also become a true democracy. We wanted to engage in trade and investment, and we did that. Unfortunately, nothing of that helped. And that is also very important that we realize what truly happened in the past 20 years. It was not us who was responsible for the increased authoritarianism or the autocratic evolution in Russia, but it was very much Putin himself. So certainly Finland has never threatened Russia, not as a neighbor, and not in NATO or without NATO. We have only invested into our own defense and deterrence in order to stay safe ourselves.
But be that as it may, you are faced with these current conditions. You and your Lithuanian neighbors, meantime, are warning in particular of the increase in hybrid attacks in recent months. We're talking cyber attacks, forced migration, acts of sabotage. A few months ago, Moscow laid out a plan to unilaterally withdraw its maritime borders in the Baltic Sea with both you and Lithuania. It quickly retracted that, but it's being seen as an attempt to sow fear. How much of a danger, just briefly, do hybrid attacks pose from Russia for Finland?
I think the hybrid attacks and the threat from those are very, very relevant. And unfortunately, we are not only talking about threat, but also the real incidents of such attacks. But that's not only Finland. We observe these attacks now everywhere in Europe. And if you really look at it in more detail, then you would see that also happening in the US and in Africa with the military coups that Russia is organizing. We have seen acts of sabotage. We have seen poisonings around Europe, and not just in the recent months, but in the recent years. So effectively, we are all affected by this aggression by Russia. And therefore, I think it was extremely important that this summer and the Washington summit, we were able to find very strong words also in the hybrid domain in the proclamation of NATO, effectively saying that such attacks could also
but I want to focus
lead to the activation of Article 5.
Right, but I want to focus on Finland in particular because the instrumentalization, of migration is just one example of a hybrid attack. You have accused Russia of forced migration at your border. And now to counteract that move, there is this new Finnish law which is said to allow Finnish border guards to force migrants and asylum seekers back into Russia. You told The Telegraph that it would only be used against migrants who have been, quote, weaponized by Moscow. How can you be so sure that it won't affect genuine asylum seekers?
Finland takes international law and our obligations extremely seriously. Well, this law we had to draft it and implement it because we didn't have the tools sufficient to counter this instrumentalized migration that Russia is organizing at that border. But at the same time, also this new law only allows for temporary closure of the sort of the border asylum seeking processing stations, and also it's geographically limited. And like noted, we have a very long border with Russia, and we would always keep some stations open for asylum seeking.
Here's what the critics say, and I'd like to ask you to respond to it directly. You know, critics say that the law violates international migration law. It sets a dangerous precedent, undermining access to asylum ultimately. We have the UNHCR in a joint statement, Amnesty International, the Council of Europe, all issuing statements of caution against it. You know, this is Finland. You're a country that prides itself on rule of law and values. You spoke about it earlier. Have you gone down a slippery slope here?
It's not a slippery slope at all. On the very contrary, unfortunately, international law or EU law haven't been drafted in a time where there was such a phenomenon like instrumentalized migration. And all countries, the partners and allies I've spoken to about this phenomenon, everybody knows that Finland and other bordering nations with either Russia or Belarus are in a very difficult situation. And in fact, not only those countries who directly share a border with Russia or Belarus, but it's obviously the entire Schengen area that is affected. And at the same time, these exactly the same concerns are shared by my colleagues also in Southern Europe, because what we see with the destabilization acts that Russia is organizing in, say, West Africa, one of their intentions is exactly to instrumentalize migration also towards European borders.
Let's take it back to Finland again, so that we can.
We are in the same boat.
Right.
But
let's take it back to Finland again, because I mean, here's what's being said specifically about this law. It's been said that the Russian objective is to make Finland look bad, to basically present this dilemma where you have to choose between immediate border security and the values and the rules and the basis of your society. They've essentially been successful at this, haven't they? They have made Finland look bad.
Yes, but I wouldn't be so worried about this, because I do know that the UN organizations have to, of course, rely on the existing conventions. But for instance, what we are now doing together with, partners and allies is that we want to look into whether there was not perhaps a way to change EU law or the international conventions, because that doesn't happen quickly, but the interpretation, so that it could be in cases where, there's a really a strong case of instrumentalized migration, that it could be treated as a fact that if a hostile country is trying to send people over, that immediately and in a geographically limited location, there was not the right to seek asylum, but we would remain, or we would keep those stations open for seeking asylum somewhere else. And this is also that Finland would be doing. We have the law now in place, but we haven't used it yet. And for using the law or really allowing our border guards to not people seek asylum, there is a very, very high hurdle for taking that into use. And secondly, countries like Norway or some of the Baltic countries, Poland, all of these countries have been issued or have been subject and victim to this phenomenon over the course of the years, and every country has been treating it in some way. And the Norwegian model, for instance, is very similar to the Finnish one. So it would be just better if we had one model for every country.
Okay, we have to move on, unfortunately, because I want to get to the situation also in the Arctic, where there is fear of a potential spillover of Russia's war in Ukraine. Russia's making up nearly half of this zone geographically, but now it's encircled by 7 NATO members. Your foreign and security policy this year says that military activity and rivalry has intensified in the region. Your government has also highlighted the growing importance of the region in strategic competition. So, in other words, countries have their eyes on mineral resources, new shipping routes, especially as temperatures rise, the ice recedes. Russia and China seem to be teaming up more and more, especially in this region. To what extent are you seeing this as a flashpoint, a site for intensifying rivalry now between the West, Russia, and China?
Yes, the Arctic is becoming more and more important by the day. Unfortunately, with the climate change, which is extremely well visible up in the north. So we appreciate it and welcome it very, very much that NATO is taking a very active approach in these matters as well. Because the Arctic will play a significant role not only for trade routes, but also for military activity, unfortunately. And we do have seen that Russia and China have increased their cooperation over the course of the past years and especially months. We would very strongly call on China to do everything in their power to have Russia end the war in Ukraine, because effectively China could achieve that if Russia could not trade so actively with China, especially in key components and technology. They couldn't be waging this war any longer.
But what incentive does China have to do that? Because, I mean, it's reported, for example, and I'm just going to bring it back to the Arctic right now, that China's been trying to promote the region as a global commons, to sort of shift the governance in its favor. It's been describing itself as near Arctic. It wants to build a polar Silk Road. How much of a danger does China pose, and is putting the faith that you've just put in it now to potentially help with the negotiations on ending the war in Ukraine? What sort of hope is there for that?
Well, I'm not asking China to facilitate any negotiations, because they could just, call Putin and say, withdraw your troops, or just end the intensified trade with Russia. Then the war would end, because this is not like a balanced situation where there was something really to negotiate about. It is about having Russia end its aggression and go back to respecting international law. But I do think we, as Europe, we do have significant offering for China. Of course, we do interact with China. We have a significant market over here, and we have very much, a lot of business going on in China. But in the future, we, of course, and even now, we need to scrutinize this ever so carefully and more carefully, because that what China is allowing Russia to do is directed against the basic principles of our security and our way of life. So, of course, we can't just, see this happening. And unfortunately, the longer we look into the future, I don't see any huge performance potential for Russia's economy, and therefore for Russia's future, for that matter. But it will be very much China who will be deciding this.
Just briefly before we go, Finland's president has said that when we look at the current world order, the post-Cold War era has died. The world is changing, but we do not exactly know where it is going yet. How do you see global power being shared in the future?
I still do think and hope that in the future, the main power lies with the people. This year we've seen a record number of elections. Not all of them have been fair. What is happening, for instance, in Venezuela, it's devastating. But at the same time, the power that lies with people who are able and free to decide on their behalf, they will always, if you give them the chance to decide, they will rather live in a free democracy than somewhere else. And this is the power we should be relying on, independent of what happens.
Finnish Foreign Minister Elina Valtonen, thank you so much for joining us on Conflict Zone.
Thank you so much.